think Riot's balance team currently has a big problem, which is that they're overly focused on win rate statistics, and it's actually much more difficult than you would think to break down why a champion, or especially why an item, has a certain win rate. And so it takes a high level of data analysis to be able to separate out all of the variables that are potentially affecting these things. And they become really extremely complicated actually quite quickly. So we're going to be taking a look at some comments from Riot Froxon about one trick's maining champions and their effect on the win rate of a champion. And, he's going to admit at the end that this look that he did into this was not done by one of Riot's data analysts. It was just something that he was looking into, and he's just, attempting to answer the question. But I think it reveals what could potentially be a bigger mistake that the Riot balance team is making, which is they're focusing, I think, in recent years, much more heavily on making sure, they get everything to a 50% win rate without necessarily being able to understand all of the reasons why a thing has the win rate that it has. And so obviously, if you just try to balance all champions and all items to a 50% win rate, that's not actually going to result in the game being balanced, because there were a lot of other factors besides the champion's actual power or the item's actual power that are influencing those things. And so we'll get into that, but first we'll just play his comments, and then we'll talk about why I think this is a huge problem for Riot's balance team.
He was saying how, one thing he hears repeated a lot in the league community is that there are champions who are played more by quote unquote like mains than casuals, like an Akshan or a Quinn or a Riven. And these champions can have an inflated win rate as a result. Is there any truth to this, or is this just kind of like community, hodgepodge essentially? And does the balance team, in fact, take that into account, that the champion has a broad or niche player base when they're making balance changes?
Yeah, one of my pet projects over the last year or a year and a half has been to very extensively research this topic. So, I wanted to find out basically, let's say, for example, you were playing Orianna and a silver person in your mid lane academy was playing Orianna. I wanted to understand what the differences between you and the silver player playing Orianna would be. And I wanted to understand what the differences between a pro player and that same silver player playing the Orianna, because we know that elite play and pro play are pretty different, right? The other thing that was lumped into this was trying to figure out how much impact someone playing their main champion or maining a champion has on the win rate, because when I look at, let's say, Yasuo's win rate on an external site, it is generally true that people playing Yasuo, there's a higher percentage of people playing Yasuo at a higher mastery level than lower mastery level, right? Like you would consider those players to be mains. However, those people are, a small percentage. Like, let's say, for example, I'm just giving a rough approximation here, but I believe it's something like 15 or 20% of people are playing a champion above 100k mastery or something like that. And so even if those players were performing really, really well, they wouldn't have as much impact on the win rate as you would expect, right? And in fact, the vast majority of people who are playing champions in ranked, probably in your experience in coaching, are in the 0 to 10k mastery range. So 30 to 40% of people playing a champion will be in the 0 to 15 games range of playing a champion, and that probably matches your coaching experience as well. So the outsized level of performance increase for the win rate that you get from being above 100k mastery or something like that, what you would consider a main, right, is pretty much offset by the people first timing that difficult champion and failing, right?
Right.
And for the most part, there is no, I did this research pretty thoroughly. The only champion who had a positive effect on win rate was Katarina.
Is
and the
that with,
effect
you mean
was
with
only
mastery?
0.4%. Sorry?
You're saying with mastery.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is so what you would consider a main is like, oh, I've played the champion a lot, right? Which I generally use as a proxy for mastery, because you just get mastery from playing, right? Obviously, you're going to get a little more if you win, but generally speaking, the only champion that actually has a positive effect on win rate for mastery is Katarina, and Evelynn is close. It's like 0.1%, and Katarina is something like 0.4%. So the amount that basically her mains, or let's say people from like 25k plus mastery or something, they're offsetting the people that are like failing on their like first 0 to
Yeah, so
15
that's making the
games
stats. Yeah,
That's
okay.
warping the stats. Yeah.
net by like 0.4%. So that's like the maximum amount that a mains would increase. And most of them are negative, because the 0 to 15 games, firstly, there's just a way higher quantity of them, of those players. And, the amount of loss that you have compared to the actual champion's win rate is a lot more significant for a difficult champion. So
Yeah.
the
All the
coin
people
swings
that
both
are
ways.
first they play against a Katarina or an Evelynn that said this champion's broken, and then they play it the next game. And it's their first time. This is what everyone says. Don't first
Yeah,
time.
exactly.
It's a chance, right? That's the people.
Exactly.
So this champion's broken. I got to play
Well,
this.
it's
and I
very
can't
interesting.
execute.
So with that piece of information, that stat you have specifically about Katarina, has that influenced the way that you think about balancing or altering Katarina?
It has, yeah, because previously, like, we wanted to learn more about how players in aggregate, like, perform on these types of characteristics, and it's an ongoing piece of research, right? Like, I do this in my spare time, so it's like, it's not really like one of our data analysts doing it, but I think my process is pretty thorough in that respect. But I'll track things like the KDA of a champion, their kills, their DPM, their GPM, the number of times they cast Q or W, and the amount of damage that they've taken, and the minions that they've killed, the damage that they've dealt, and stuff like that. And then I can see the difference between, let's say, a pro Zeri player, a elite Zeri player, a high mastery Zeri player, and just a normal Zeri player. And then I'll be like, oh, actually, Zeri players in pro play cost 27% more Qs by equivalent game time, or Zeri players in elite cost 17% more Qs, or something like that. And then that might give us some information on how we might want to adjust the champion in the future, and things like that.
Interesting.
Going back to, I'm really curious about this data.
Okay, so to get into it, basically, and he does say at the end, right, that this is not something that one of Riot's data analysts did. This was just something that he looked into. It also sounds like he was more interested or more focused on looking into the differences between, somebody who wasn't skilled on a champion playing it versus the way that somebody who is skilled on a champion plays it versus pro play, in order to make certain balanced decisions around that. But there is an important point here which needs to be addressed, which is I think that Riot's balance team in recent years has taken an approach where they're much more concerned with win rates and getting everything as close as possible to a 50% win rate. But if there are a lot of different variables going into what causes a champion, or especially an item, to have a certain win rate, if you're just aiming to get everything to 50%, the game will not be balanced, because there are a lot of different factors playing into those things, and so we'll get into that. But basically, if everything was 50%, an item that cost much more but is giving you the same value would be much worse, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there are lots of other reasons besides that. So first off, when we get into it, I don't think that he's correct, or I think that maybe the way that he's stating the effect that champion mains have on the win rate, I think that he's either his data analysis is wrong, or the way that he's stating it is misleading. Because obviously, if you have more champion mastery, you're going to win more games, and so obviously there is some positive effect that champion mains are having on the win rate of a champion. And usually when we're talking about this concept, when related to balancing, we're specifically talking about champions like Braum, who have a very low pick rate, but a very high win rate. And the question that Riot is asking is, do we need to nerf a champion that's at a 54% win rate or a 53 or 52% win rate if only 2 or 3% of games they're getting picked? And so most of those games, or like a huge chunk of those games, are being influenced by people who are just good at the champion. And so you see this all the time. There will be champions who nobody considers, broken or unbalanced to play against. But they have like a crazy win rate in solo queue or something like that. But it's because their pick rate is like, the lowest in the game. And so you'll see, a Heimerdinger or a Quintop or something like that, these really niche champions. And we kind of know intrinsically that it's just the fact that the people who are playing the champion, most of the games on the champion, or even just a statistically significant number of games, it doesn't have to be the majority, is going to influence the win rate in some way. And we also kind of intrinsically know that the less games the champion has, the more likely that's the case, or the larger the effect. And also the higher rank you're looking at balancing, or you're looking at win rate data for, the more of an effect that's going to have as well. So most of the time when we're looking at win rate data in general, we're looking at like Platinum Plus win rate data. Of course, Riot is looking at all ranks as well as a consideration. So they're looking at all kinds of different win rates, including lower elo. But when we look at win rates, we're often only considering like Platinum or Emerald Plus. And when we're balancing for elite play or pro play, we're really only looking at, a very small number of games and a very small number of players involved. And so it becomes even more skewed when you consider that in very higher elos, like in Masters Plus, the win rate on a champion is probably even more dictated by the amount of people who main the champion at that rank, because they're probably likely to be, if you got all the way to Masters Plus, you're likely to be some sort of champion main, right? It would be almost impossible to not be. And B, also because people are more hesitant to pick a champion they're not as comfortable on, at a higher rank. And so the point is that we can kind of take a look at an example, and so we know that logically it doesn't make sense. So what do I think? I think that what he means is that the effect, or you would call it, like in this case, like we can see here, although this is a different delta, the delta, or the change between the win rate without one tricks and the win rate with one tricks. I think that what he's talking about there is just how much they're compensating versus the other champion. Because he says, for example, that one of the only ones that he saw a positive effect on was Katarina. Well, it should be a positive effect for every champion if he means what we think he means, which is, our one tricks increasing the win rate of the champion. That should obviously be a yes. I mean, we know without really even looking into the data that that's a yes, because the more you play the champion, the higher your win rate's going to be. And we'll get into some of this data that we can look at here, although we don't have access to as much data as he does with querying the API. But the point is that not only do we know that, but on top of that, right, so it can't be a negative effect. The idea that a higher percentage of people playing the champion have more experience on the champion, therefore the win rate's lower, doesn't make sense. So what he must mean is that when you compare the effect on the win rate, the negative effect on the win rate, people who are just sporadically playing the champion every now and again, that their negative effect is larger than the positive effect that one tricks are having. But that doesn't mean that one tricks aren't having a significant effect or aren't a significant variable that needs to be considered. They are, and it depends on the champion. And so you can't just ignore the problem because you did an analysis and Katarina was the only one that it mattered on. it actually matters on all of them. And we'll get into that. So we can see here on this site, and he defined champion mastery a little bit differently, right? You can do that, but these are, going to provide similar results either way, which is Froxen decided to use 100,000 mastery as an example. This site, what we're looking at here is basically saying, what is your win rate on the champion if you have 50 or more ranked games on the champion? So that's one way to define a one trick or a main, right? I think the most technical definition that you could get would really be, does a certain percentage of their ranked games come from this champion? So it should be, 20% or more of their ranked games or something like that come from this champion, meaning they can only main, like a maximum of 5 champions, and it'll probably label them as maining, like 4 to 3 or 2 champions or something like that. And so anyways, you could define it different ways, but the point still remains, which is that you can see that pretty much consistently across the board, every single champion in the game, except Ziggs apparently, every single champion in the game, the people who have 50 or more ranked games played on the champion always win more than the people who, than the generic win rate on the champion. Not to mention the fact that this effect, this delta that we're observing here, is even larger than this, because this is the win rate Platinum Plus including these players, not the win rate excluding these players. So if this is 10.5%, you actually have to take into account that, this 60% win rate on these games is actually being applied to the win rate in general as well. And so it's even worse than this shows, right? And so you can see that there is actually quite a large difference in win rate, as you would expect, once you know how to play the champion. The question then becomes, how big of an effect does that have based on how many games are being played by one tricks versus how many games are being played by people picking the champion for the first time. So Froxen threw out for an example, which I think is fairly accurate, on Yasuo, and it's going to depend on the champion, right? Because some champions, like Braum, and again at higher ranks too, more of the people playing the champion are going to be people who main the champion, because the champion has a low pick rate, and if you get into higher elo, more of the games are going to be played by people who are one tricks, because the one tricks and higher elo are probably playing a lot of games, and on top of that, people are more hesitant to pick the champion and stuff like that if they don't know how to play it, and so it's going to be even more skewed that way. So it depends on the champion, right? But let's do a little experiment with Braum and see, if Froxen is right, that Katarina is the only champion that has some sort of positive effect from this. I think, again, what he means is that the difference between the negative effect that people who have picked up the champion for a couple of games or for one game have versus the effect that one tricks have is mostly in favor of, or being pulled stronger by, the people who are first timing the champion, which I would agree with, but that doesn't mean that you don't need to take this into account for every champion, because it's going to be different on different champions. So for example, take Braum, right, which is my champion. I personally know, and I could name them if you want, but I personally know that you got like me, Blocks, Morbid Mike, this new Colton guy, and stuff like that. There are definitely, at any given time, about 5 Braum mains in Masters Plus and NA. And even if they're not quite in Masters Plus, if they're in like D1 or D2, they could still match into the lobbies and stuff like that. So anyways, the point is basically the same. But obviously this is an estimate because we don't have complete access to Riot's API. So what we can do is we can look at last patch, since that's the full patch data, instead of, if we looked at this patch, we'd have not enough games. So we can look at the full patch from last patch, and we can select Master Plus and NA, and let's just say that there are 5 Braum players, Braum mains, in Masters Plus in NA. I think that that's a very reasonable assumption. Like I said, I know that there are 5. I could name them all. If we add up the number of games that were played, we're using here, and this is slightly less because I suppose it's possible people ran a bunch of games with different summoner spells, but almost all of the games that people played on Braum were going to be Exhaust Flash or Ignite Flash. Maybe some Heal Flash games or something that we're missing, but this is a pretty good estimate. What we get is that on the last patch in Masters NA+, there were only 932 ranked games played. Basically what we can do is we can say, if the 5 of us played 3 ranked games a day for 14 days, which is the length of the patch, or 2 weeks, 14 times 3 would be 42. So if we each play 42 games times 5, that would be 210 games. If you take the 210 games that the 5 of us Braum mains play and divide by 932, you get an answer of 22.5%. In other words, 22.5% of the games that were played, as a rough estimate, in NA Masters Plus last patch on Braum were being played by like the 5 best Braum players on the server. Let's say. It could even be worse than that if you consider that there could be 6 or 7 of us and then the numbers change, right? And it could also be worse because I think that the number of games being set at 3 a day is a fair assumption. But look, there are a lot of days I play more than 3 games a day on Braum. It is what it is. And so, hey, we might be playing more than 40 games a patch each, to be honest with you. Depends on the person. Some of us play more, some of us play less. I think it's a fair estimate, but it's possible that that's higher as well. Anyways, the point is that, this actually does kind of line up with what he was talking about. He was just using Yasuo as an example, so obviously it's going to be different on different champions. But I think that we got a close enough answer to what he said, which is about 15% of the games being played are one tricks on Yasuo. On Braum, we got 22.5%. So then the question would be, well, how big of an impact does that have then? Well, let's assume, and this isn't necessarily the case, but let's assume that we're winning 55.3% of our games. I'm certainly not, but maybe Blocks is carrying me or something like that. If we're winning, this, because we do fall in the category of 50 plus ranked games, all of us, on the champion, pretty much, then what is the difference between this and this? It's about 4%. So if we're 23% of the games that are being played, and we're winning 4% more than the average Braum player, how are we throwing off the win rate? We're throwing off the win rate by 0.92%, or almost 1% exactly. So I think that actually falls in line with what people have been assuming for years, which is that it's okay for a champion to sit at a 51 or a 52% win rate if they have a high pick rate, a low pick rate, because the people who are playing the champion are much more likely to be proficient on the champion. Obviously, he must have been talking about that negative effect that first timing the champion is having versus the positive effect that one tricks are having, because clearly, right, one tricks are having, not just on Katarina, a 0.4% impact, but it's pretty clear to me that in Masters Plus for Braum, we're having a 1% increase on the win rate, more or less. And so it's at least statistically significant enough to note that it's probably okay for Braum to have a resting win rate in Masters Plus and in NA of 51 or 52% or something like that. That's totally fine. It gets worse. I'm not really concerned with Braum because Braum's win rate is not, I don't think Braum's going to get nerfed. I don't think that his win rate is way too high or anything like that. I'm actually more concerned with the same concept being applied to items like Knight's Vow, for example. So now let's get into this. So it's the same concept, just slightly different theory, which is that if you look at an item like Knight's Vow, it has a very good win rate, right? It's got a better win rate than Frozen Heart. It's got a much better win rate than Locket. But we know that Knight's Vow is a worse item than Locket, and it's a worse item than Frozen Heart, and frankly, it's so bad, I just, explained and showed the math behind why it's not even worth building in my Braum guide, which I just released for Season 14. And so the question becomes, well, why does Knight's Vow have such a high win rate if we know that it's worse than these other items? And we seem to all recognize this, right? Because we're all building Locket first. So it's not like we're, falling for this trick based on the win rate of the item. We seem to think that Locket's better. Well, the answer is that if you most people are buying Knight's Vow on Braum, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, right? And so the reality is, whereas almost everybody's buying Locket first. So if the game ends and you only have 2,200 gold on Braum, you'll have Locket and it'll count as a loss. But if you end with Knight's Vow, you probably ended the game with like 4,000 or 6,000 or 8,000 gold, which means you are much more likely to win. Because when you're winning, you earn more gold than when you're losing. And so quite a huge discrepancy in the win rate can basically be chalked up to, maybe the item costs more, and so all that it meant is that you had more gold, and so you were able to afford this expensive item. That's not the case with Locket and Knight's Vow. Maybe it's that people build Locket first item every game, and Knight's Vow doesn't get bought until later in your build, so you only get it. You get it more often when you're far ahead and you're many items into your build and winning the game super hard. And so that accounts for the win rate. Well, what I worry about is that an item like Knight's Vow, which in my opinion is completely unbuildable, even though it's like the core item that you would want to build on Braum, it's like the most on-theme item Braum could possibly have. It's an item I'd really like to be able to build, but I can't because they're never going to buff it when it's sitting at a 56% win rate. I even saw the other day when I was looking at some of these stats, I saw Knight's Vow sitting at a 60% win rate on a patch or something like that. Maybe it was 2 patches ago. This is a huge problem. And right now, if you watched my Braum guide and agree with what I'm saying, and the math behind the reasoning for what I was saying, then you'd understand that there isn't a whole lot of item diversity in the game. We're actually lucky that on Braum we have a choice between, Bramble Vest, and then if it's not Bramble Vest, you get to choose between like 5 or 6 other items. Yes, you only get to choose one item and it's your 3rd item, so you don't always get to it. But a lot of champions have even more static builds than that, where they don't even get a choice, like that. I think that items in League should be close enough in power level that you can choose between one or the other depending on the situation, and show that you know what the items do and you know what the enemy team comp does, and get rewarded appropriately, by winning an extra 1 or 2% of your games for picking the correct items. I think that that's totally fine, and that's good for the game. And that rather than the game being about, okay, we've changed all the items, take a month to solve the math and figure out what items are way better than the other ones, and then you read Kanik Rookern and you realize it's like way more powerful than the other tank items, so everybody builds Kanik Rookern, and then the build is solved until Riot decides to nerf that item, and then you just move on to the next most powerful one. They need to set up items so that, okay, there's actually a situation where Randuin's is best, and there's a situation where Frozen Heart is best, and there's a situation where Kanik Rookern is best. But they haven't really set that up. They set it up so that Kanik Rookern is like way more powerful than the other ones, and then like Frozen Heart is sort of good, and then and then the items fall off for tanks really, really hard, and none of the tank support items are good at all. They're really, really bad, which is kind of counterintuitive to what they're talking about, because they're talking about wanting there to be less damage in the game, and they're talking about wanting you know, like wanting to encourage people to play champions like Braum because it makes the game more fun because people don't die as quickly, well then, you know, you should make Knight's Vow good and you should make Braum good instead of him, you know, sitting in a... He's in a decent spot right now, I'm not going to lie, but, you know, I just think Knight's Vow should be an item choice. This is the other thing you have to understand. Buffing Knight's Vow, right, and bringing it on par with Canik Rookhorn or Frozen Heart does not increase Braum's power level, because it just means that he'll substitute Canik Rookhorn for Knight's Vow and it'll be roughly the same power level, and so he won't see a power increase. So his, you know, his win rate shouldn't dramatically shoot up if you do something to Knight's Vow. So, you know, I wouldn't worry too much about that either. So anyways, the point is, in conclusion, that I think Riot's a little bit too concerned with getting win rates to 50%, and especially when it comes to items, where you see some items, you know, like Zeke's at a 58% or Thornmail at 58%. I mean, this is a great example because Bramblevest actually has a, you know, 10% lower win rate than Thornmail, even though you get all of the value from Thornmail and Bramblevest, and so it's much smarter to just sit on Bramblevest. This just means that you were so rich in the game and so far ahead that you could waste 1,900 gold on completing Thornmail, because you had that much gold to throw away on Braum. So, you know, if they balance everything like this, what they're going to do is they're going to nerf Thornmail down to 50% win rate, and then the upgrade on Bramblevest would have to literally just be Bramblevest, otherwise they couldn't get this win rate down by 10% at all. So, you know, and meanwhile you've got an item like Canik Rookhorn, which is actually broken, sitting at a 59% win rate, and then you've got an item like Knight's Vow, which is terrible, but its win rate is deceptively high. So there's a lot of complicated things going on here with the statistics, and I just hope that Riot doesn't over nerf champions attempting to get them back to 50%, you know, that are unpopular and only being played by a small fraction of players who understand how to play the champion really well. And when it comes to items, they need to, you know, it's not about adding a bunch of new items to the game or getting rid of items that people find annoying or something like that. It's about making items that people might choose between actually have a choice between going them, instead of one being, you know, way more optimal than another. And the problem is, when I hear Freak every week when he talks about what they're doing for the next patch, talking about win rates and adjusting a win rate by 0.5%, it comes across as we don't really understand, you know, why Knight's Vow or some of these items are good or bad. They think that Canik Rookhorn, and maybe this is the case with Canik Rookhorn, this is why it's so complicated. When you spout that, you know, oh, this won't be a nerf to this champion because you can just go this other item and it's got the same win rate or something like that, so it doesn't even matter, you're probably missing something, right? Like, it could even be as simple as a cost differential. It could be that people are building the item third or fourth or whatever. It got to the point where I was trying to use item win rates, right, as I would as a tool to figure out what build to go to try to compare items and how powerful they are. And I had to completely throw looking at item win rates out the window, because the effect that building the item third or fourth can have on its win rate, bringing it up because you're buying it when you get to your third or fourth item and therefore winning more games, it's so large for items that I was just getting deceived when I was trying to figure out what items were good. And I know that Knight's Vow isn't good, and so you know, I was getting to the point where I had to completely throw the win rates out entirely to try to figure out what items were better than others when I was optimizing my Braum build. And well, if the balance team is almost solely relying on win rate data for items and not considering these other factors, or even doing the data analysis but missing a variable or doing it slightly incorrectly, they're going to end up balancing the game wrong, and that's all there is to it. So I hope you found this interesting. But in the future, any personal applications, I would say worry about Riot's balance team trying to get everything to 50%, because that's not actually an appropriate way to balance a game when there's many different variables impacting a champion and an item's win rate. And also, when you look at win rate data on runes and on items and on champions, be aware that they're incredibly skewed. If anything, what I was interested in here, which I'll leave you with this tidbit, is I was interested in what champion for support has a really good win rate when you have the 50 plus ranked games. And the ones that are really coming up here are like Blitzcrank and Leona. Well, Braum's in here too, actually. So Blitzcrank, Leona, Alistar, Braum. These are champions that are having a really good win rate when you play a decent amount of them. So if you want a champion that, if you learn the champion and play them really well, you can have maybe a higher skill cap on, or a higher skill ceiling, or win more of your games on, or carry harder. It's looking like right now, according to this data, Blitzcrank, Leona, very good for support. Braum's up here as well, so that's nice. Hope you guys enjoyed. See you next time.